So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Sydney Fellows, and I'm honored to introduce this training session on organic certification for wild harvested crops. We have participants with us today from various tribes, certifiers, state and local agencies. Your presence here speaks to the importance of this topic, and we're excited to explore it with you all. So to orient us all around this topic, what does it mean to certify a wild crop as organic? Today, we will explore how someone would pursue this certification. This training is designed to equip you with the knowledge and resources needed to support producers in implementing organic wild crop harvesting standards. I'll start off by introducing the Northwest Center for Alternatives to Pesticides, or NCAP. NCAP began in 1977 with a group of concerned citizens who worked to shift forest management practices in the Pacific Northwest. Today, our organization works to protect both community and environmental health by advocating for the adoption of ecologically sound solutions to reduce pesticide usage. NCAP has a diverse approach that encompasses education, organizing, outreach, technical assistance, and policy advocacy. We operate across Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Western Montana, and Northern California. And we are at the forefront of efforts to transition away from toxic pesticides, particularly within communities that are disproportionately impacted by pesticide exposure, including people employed as migrant and seasonal field workers, and people living in and around agricultural fields. This past winter, my colleague Christina Stucker-Gassi and I, along with our partners at the Rodale Institute and Salmon Valley Stewardship, identified the need for training around the National Organic Program Wild Crop Harvest Standard. This training today the focus of today's training aligns well with NCAP's vision. A brief introduction for myself that gives a glimpse into our organization's work with NCAP. For the past 4 years, I've worked with NCAP on a variety of projects focused on installing native plants across Idaho onto farmer, rancher, and tribal lands. In the past 2.5 years, we've created projects in collaboration with my tribes, the Shoshone-Bannock in Fort Hall, Idaho. In these projects, we prioritize tribal values, such as strengthening access to traditional foods, which is a value that gives health to our human communities in ways that go beyond just the calories. So while we install native plants to support healthy, non-human landscapes that we all depend on, we also create access to traditional foods that are inherently connected to our tribe's language, the transmission of intergenerational knowledge, and other cultural parts of our community. Even though our tribal community has unique pursuits when it comes to native plant installations, the way that I see it in the end, these sort of tribal values benefit us all. This work within the tribal community is work that NCAP is committed to supporting long-term, and we're eager to see how today's training will lend insight to how the wild harvest certification may benefit this sort of work. We are privileged to have Matthew Molyneaux join us today. He is a technical specialist with Oregon Tilth and will discuss the intricacies of the organic certification processes for crops harvested from the so-called wild. This session aims to foster collaboration and knowledge exchange to support the adoption of organic wild crop harvesting practices. You will gain insights into how organic practices can aid in ecosystem preservation, long-term environmental conservation, and promote practice change including alternatives to chemical management of unwanted species on managed lands. This is a balance we hope to explore more in the upcoming 201 training that will happen this fall. By understanding the details of organic certification for wild harvested crops, you will be better equipped to guide producers in maintaining the integrity of their harvesting practices and the health of the ecosystems they help manage. Lastly, a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded, and we will send out a link to the recording along with any resources mentioned during the presentation. If you experience any technical difficulties, please use the Q&A feature to reach out to Christina Stucker-Gossi, who is on standby to assist you. And lastly, we encourage you to stay engaged throughout the webinar by using the Q&A feature. Your participation is what makes these sort of events so valuable. Without further ado, let's get started. Matthew, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Sydney. I appreciate that introduction and the work NCAP is doing to set the stage for this kind of event. Really, really awesome. Oh, goodness. Okay. I'm going to have to ask for sharing permission here. Sorry, I'm going to share my screen and my slideshow. And it's telling me the host must allow multiple sharing for this webinar. Great. Oh, goodness. Well, we'll start with the introductory slide here. Give me just a moment, and there may be a few of those kind of glitches today, but I think we're all used to that in the Zoom world. Well, welcome today to the wild world of NOP wild crops. This training will dive into the various types of wild crops harvested and outline organic certification requirements for these crops. My name is Matthew Molyneaux, and I am a technical specialist with Oregon Tilth, the second largest certification agency in the US. We have over 2,400 certified operations. I was an organic inspector for 15 years prior to my current role, having conducted organic inspections in 23 states for all scopes of certification. I'm also a native plant enthusiast and a frequent visitor to our wildlands. I live 2 miles from the Umpqua National Forest here in Western Oregon on a 30-acre property bordered by BLM lands. My favorite foraging finds are chanterelle mushrooms and both red and black huckleberries. There's a picture of me in my garden setting in front of some stinging nettles that I started from seed I collected from the wild. And there's also a graphic of some Oregon graperoot and echinacea and usnea in a cedar tree. So I wanted to thank NCAP for inviting me here today, and TOP, which we'll talk a bit more about later, the Transition to Organic Production Partnership, and all of you folks for attending today for this unique topic, certified organic wild crops. So what are the National Organic Program standards? Whenever you see the USDA organic logo on produce or processed food products in the marketplace, you know that crops and ingredients were verified by a third-party accredited agency like Oregon Tilth or one of the various state organic agriculture programs as being produced following the organic standards. Every year, certified operations go through an on-site inspection and audit of their records to verify their practices meet the mark. There are 3 scopes of certification, which include crops, livestock, and processing or handling. Wild crop harvesting is often considered a 4th scope, but represents a relatively small margin of the $60 billion per year domestic sales figure for certified organic items. Here we see the landing page of 7 CFR Part 205, which is the full text of the organic standards. These were born from OFPA, the Organic Foods Production Act, which gave rise to the 2002 USDA NOP standards, NOP standing for National Organic Program. This brought all regional organic certifiers under one umbrella and the framework under which we operate today. So let's take a look at some definitions and standards or rules for certified organic wild crops. Starting with the top, really the only definition we have is any plant or portion of a plant that is collected or harvested from a site that is not maintained under cultivation or other agricultural management. So the standards at 205, 207 require a 3-year land history with no prohibited materials applied, and subsection B, harvested in a manner that ensures that such harvesting or gathering will not be destructive to the environment and will sustain the growth and production of the wild crop. And the highlighted text is a general certification requirement for all certified operations to ensure production practices implemented in accordance with this subpart must maintain or improve the natural resources of the operation, including soil and water quality. So as you can see, there's little detail here in this published standard outside of complying with the overall certification requirements. So as a response, the NOP, National Organic Program, drafted a policy guidance with some more explicit requirements. We'll take a look at those now. So there is a lot of text on this slide. I apologize for that, but it just captures part of this policy guidance, which is about 4 pages on its own. And I can provide some links to these, the one at the top there. We can maybe put that in the chat towards the end so folks can have access if you're unfamiliar. So taking a look at the highlighted sections for clarification, that if any management techniques other than sustainable harvesting are employed, it may not be considered a wild crop. It does give allowances for pruning existing plants, scattering existing seed, or removal of non-native species as approved wild crop practices. Management practices beyond that are considered crop production, and operations must apply for the crop scope of certification. Any form of irrigation, adding input materials, propagating new plants, or introducing seeds, shade cloth, etc., are not allowed for wild crops. The last section of this slide says, unmanaged, untrained, and uninformed harvesting of wild products from a wild habitat without maintaining or improving the natural resources can disqualify the wild products from organic certification. So this puts the onus on the harvesters to maintain the viability of the stand and the surrounding environment and train their employees or other harvesters in these methods. I think this was an important distinction that was produced in this policy memo. And again, there's 4 pages of this clarifying comments. I just kind of cherry-picked some of the important points here to discuss. So now we've defined the standards and have some context for these practices. So how do we do this? Become certified organic. Creating an organic system plan, or OSP, is required of all certified operations. This plan will document all of your practices. Many sections of the basic crop OSP do not apply to wild crop operations, as they include management practices. The ones that do apply will focus on the following. So the one at the top here, general site information. So here we need verification that the harvest sites are free from prohibited materials for 36 months preceding harvest. We will also need maps that clarify the harvest area and borders or buffer zones, and we'll touch a bit more on that later. Also included is a general business information, name, address, contact information, this type of thing. The next section, natural resource conservation activities. This is a part of every crop producer's OSP and part of what makes organic unique. The operation describes practices in conserving resources, including habitat, and enhancing biodiversity of their site. In a typical farm setting, where perhaps a monocrop is grown, incorporating hedgerows, pollinator plants, cover crops, or other practices are required. For wild crops, we look to potential impacts on soil and water quality, erosion concerns, or impacts on other species present. Okay, so looking at harvest practices. Any post-harvest handling activities will also be detailed here. Simple drying is generally allowed, but other activities may be considered handling and possibly need an additional scope of certification. In general, you will describe how the crop gets from the field, or in this case, wildland, to the marketplace, and all of the steps in between. So packaging and labeling. Not all packaging is created equal. Perhaps this is just a bulk harvest with bins, totes, or bags, and not retail packaging. There is some organic labeling still required to identify the item as organic. So more details on this part of the OSP are available either on our website or by viewing blank OSP forms. So contamination prevention. In a wild setting, would think of roadside herbicide spraying or aerial spraying or even fire retardant. Perhaps morels can't be harvested from a burn area if it was treated until 3 years have lapsed. Or point source pollution from industry into aquatic areas. Is your harvest area well away from any potential sources of contamination? You will need to describe this. How about shared harvest containers or bins or vehicle storage areas? Are they cleaned prior to contact with your organic crops? And of course, record keeping. So for those of us in the organic certification world, we know it all comes down to the records. Detailed harvest and sales records are required of all certified operations and will be thoroughly audited. Inspectors will conduct an audit of detailed dates and quantities of harvest, all transportation records, shipping, bills of lading, weight slips, if applicable, and reconcile the quantities harvested with sales over a given time period. Here we would generally evaluate yields as well, and this can be challenging in a wild crop setting, as harvest areas may be vast and quantities may be small, or they can be substantial. The Oregon Tilth version of the organic system plan has a section called W1, which we will see in a minute, that captures the details specific to wild crop practices. Other certifiers may require a detailed narrative on your practices outlined in some of these other OSP sections above. So maps are another crucial part of the OSP, especially so for wild crops. Here we see a U.S. Forest Service section map with outlined certified harvest areas for mushrooms on the left, and a map of Upper Klamath Lake where organic blue-green algae is wild harvested. There are some missing elements to these maps that are required for all certified operations. Maps require a north directional arrow, a description of neighboring land use activities and buffer zones, and any key distinguishing features, any key distinguishing features should also be noted on the maps. So in reading a map, looking at that Forest Service map, we know that each section represented by a square on the topo map is 640 acres or 1 square mile. So this operation has identified 5 sections totaling 3,200 acres. This is one of several sites that they may harvest from. You can see there's kind of good road access in that map there, and makes sense for a wild harvest area. So just another component of a complete organic system plan describing all of your practices, where you'll be harvesting from for review and certification. So here's an OSP module completed for a new mock client, Rob's Wild Foods. We're going to go over some conflicting issues and vague statements that might need clarification. So this could hold up your application for organic certification if your answers are not clear. I'm going to zoom in here and I'll apologize. I've had some issues testing this out and advancing the slide. If it happens, I'll just come back. But I want to make sure, there we go, that folks can read the text well enough. So bear with me here for just a moment. Okay, so looking at question 1. First, the crop listing is too vague. Mushrooms, berries, herbs cannot be listed as such on an organic certificate, and we'd likely need to detail varieties here. So what types of mushrooms? Edible herbs, we need specificity on what exactly you would be harvesting as organic to list on the certificate. So reading question 2, the answer, I usually get a permit. Well, what does that mean? Your current permit will be reviewed every year at the organic inspection. And that's if you're harvesting from lands that require a permit. So looking at question 3. Well, the answer looks okay, but does lack detailed descriptions. So edible herb harvesting can impact the environment. And here we look for some descriptions in that regard. And then question 4 looks to verify that all harvesters are trained. So the answer is no, but then there's myself and my son harvesting. So how do we know that they're informed of your harvesting practices? Do you do a training? What are their practices? So question 5, what percentage is harvested? Well, here he says 100%. So I'm going to harvest 100% of what I find. Well, is that sustainable? And does it comply with the NOP standards? That might be a point of clarification that's going to be needed. I'll let you read question 6 and decide if the answer is enough. So we're picking up mushrooms when they're ripe. We might rake the forest floor to find them. Berries are picked when ripe, or sometimes a berry rake to strip the shrubs, and herbs are, of course, cut down and dug out by the roots as needed. So they are describing their harvesting practices. And this is sometimes the struggle with organic certifiers and inspectors in evaluating a producer's practices and whether those practices outlined here meet the mark with ensuring longevity of the stand and following those specific definitions as we've outlined already in the standards. Are they leaving some crop behind to regenerate or otherwise utilizing that resource in a way that promotes ecological sustainability? So number 7, the statement there is we make sure to have enough each year and only replant if needed. So he's indicating here replanting, which we know this may not be allowed under the standards. Scattering seed, existing seed is allowed, but not replanting. So we'd want some clarification here. So bear with me, moving over. Okay, so number 8 and 9, describe how you monitor the health of the wild crop population and how often monitoring is performed. So to me, this is not answered correctly. I believe that this answer is true, but it does not describe monitoring practices in enough detail and how the health of the wild crop is evaluated. So sometimes we find this in reviewing applications for organic certification. We have a pretty detailed question, describe the monitoring, how you monitor health of the population and how often it's performed. Well, every year we scout new areas to harvest from and we're experts. This is what we do. We identify edible plants and herbs. So monitoring the health was missed as an answer there. And so essentially this application may get kicked back to you to clarify these answers, which could delay this process, which could take 90 days or more when you first turn it in to become certified. If your harvest season's coming up, you want to do this well in advance. And the last question, let me move this over a bit, sorry. Any rare, threatened, or endangered species exist in the wild crop harvest area? The answer is no, but then the comment in the space provided is I don't know. So it doesn't appear to be answered correctly. Perhaps future research is needed by this applicant to verify they understand the standards and their practices they're going to employ will meet those standards. Okay. So here I've made a list of some wild crops that I've encountered in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm interested to know, and we can touch on this towards the end of the presentation, if there's any different species collected in the inland Northwest. There may be some that could be included on this slide. And I also realize there are other medicinal and native plants, and I was targeting some species that have commercial marketability and a demand in organics. So we can further discuss some other options folks have seen. Things like mullein and nettle didn't make it to this list. Kelp and blue-green algae are also common organic wild harvested items on a commercial scale. And likewise, there may be other regional crops for folks outside of this area, such as wild rice in the Great Lakes, or ginseng or golden seal, that's wild crop harvested in Appalachia. As I've touched on here, there's St. John's wort at the top, thinking about things like mullein and nettle, perhaps considered weeds by some agency managers. These may have value for some of these large-scale herbal manufacturers or ingredient houses that want these items in organic form. I'll let you folks read through this list, and if you have some knowledge of these particular species, you may know their medicinal values and perhaps harvesting methods where we're taking bark from a portion of a tree, but not so much as to girdle it. Had a discussion yesterday with some of the participants about yew tree, which Taxol was a compound that came from yew bark that was widely popularized in the 70s and in the early 80s and was over harvested to the detriment of the species in a lot of our national forest areas. So something to keep in mind in terms of sustainable harvest. Lots of berries, of course. We think of commercial scale organic certification, but perhaps someone has a farmer's market booth that has organic certification for both crops and wild crops. And so harvesting some of these for direct marketing may be a model that someone may employ. Rose hips, currants, gooseberries, spruce tips, you think of flavoring. I've seen beer or even kombucha flavored with spruce tips. If this is a certified organic product, well, where are those fresh spruce tips coming from for that ingredient? From a certified organic, either crop area or wild crop area. Of course, mushrooms are going to be a really large category and something that is commercially produced in the crop scope and wild crop scope. And so I think that's an important one. And looking at things like lichen or usnea. So now we're getting into non-plant species, which the USDA National Organic Program doesn't have a great definition of some of these wild harvested, we'll call them items that are actually not plant species, fungus, lichen, kelp, and algae. And so, yeah, looking for some future development in the standards in this regard. So permits are required for commercial harvesting from federally managed lands. Be sure the proper documents are in hand before heading out. This is a list from the U.S. Forest Service of some of the items allowed for commercial harvesting with a permit. Operators for certified organic must comply with all other applicable state and federal laws. So this is where we might engage other land managers in the room. Oops, sorry about that. Towards the end of the presentation here, to see if any of those folks have had applicants looking for permits for areas that would comply with the organic requirements. Or maybe they've signed affidavits attesting to no treatments in a particular unit. I have seen these documents completed a few times over the years for organic certified clients in their files. Another point to consider is that private lands may be used for wild certified wild crop harvesting. This can be timberland or rangeland that may be leased for harvesting and still meet requirements for organic certifications. So looking from this list here and some of the other species identified on the previous slide, they identify categories as foliage, seed, nuts, fruits and berries. Tree sap, maple syrup harvesting is another common wild crop scope product in the Northeast or New England, and I don't have a lot of direct experience there. Mushrooms, of course, identified here, herbs, medicinal purposes. There are also like cut foliage, flowers, or nursery stock plants identified here. Not a huge organic market for those type of products. For certified organic cut foliage or nursery stock, still something that's been developed. Cacti is mentioned here. I've actually done a wild crop inspection in the Southwest desert of the nopales. Flower buds used for a flavoring and coloring ingredient. So a really wide range of applicable wild crops and unique to things that we normally see. I'll touch a bit on mushroom harvesting here. It has its own unique set of considerations. This graphic is from the U.S. Forest Service website. It's divided between matsutake and all other edible species. A different permit is required for each, at least in Western Oregon. So the other graphics on this slide, this one was repurposed from a training that was specific for inspectors for wild crop inspections, and they would need to know if their harvest areas are accessible due to either fire activity or snow levels for when they plan the inspection. They will want to be able to see crops growing and ideally being harvested when inspecting these sites. So having some background into where you're going and if those areas are accessible, is also important. And it was also to prompt them to maybe do some research independently onto different mushroom species or some of these herb species that I've identified may be necessary if they're not familiar with these crops. A lot of our inspectors and certification staff may be used to alfalfa, apples, wheat, or wine grapes and have expert level knowledge on those, but not some of these oddball wild crops. So some of the other species here seen are chicken of the woods mushrooms and boletes. So prompting them again to do some research on their own into these unique species, requirements from agency managers, as well as the permitting process. So let's talk a bit about contamination potential. This is also unique in wild areas. Become familiar with the types of pollution and whether they emanate from one location, point source, or may be varied, runoff, or things like that, which would be non-point source. Consider other external sources of potential contamination to organic wild crops from the air, water, and background. Do the maps on file indicate any potential contamination sources? Were there any significant events in the region that could affect the wild harvest areas? These crops may also be harvested from areas that are used for recreation or by other users for harvesting. So evaluating contamination sources for wild crops are quite different from those in an agricultural setting. This may be determining factors. Apologize there. I don't know why we're auto advancing here. I am trying not to click. Okay, back to it. So there may be determining factors into whether your harvest areas can comply with organic requirements. Another certification requirement is that samples are collected from a minimum of 5% of certified operations annually for pesticide residue analysis. There are over 350 different chemicals used in conventional agriculture that are screened for. Further, some buyers, thinking about these large wholesale herbal product manufacturers or distributors, they'll test incoming ingredients in-house if they're organic or even just wild harvest. And so the goal there is no detected residues. So carefully considering your wild crop harvest areas is very important. Okay, so we'll touch on various harvest practices here. Many simple post-harvest handling activities can be covered under the wild crop scope, while some handling scope or additional processors that are certified for handling. So you may be able to do simple post-harvest handling, or if your product requires further offsite, they may need to be certified. So the OSP, Organic System Plan, should detail these activities as an on-site assessment of crop handling and storage areas, if they exist, is done with each inspection. Inspectors will review these practices, crop washing, storage areas, pest control practices in storage areas, cleaning or sanitation chemicals, etc. Any off-site entities that may further process or handle your wild crops via cleaning, destemming, extraction, or other practice would also have to be certified organic to maintain organic integrity in the chain of custody. And so this is kind of where we draw a line of bulk crop harvesting versus any post-harvest handling that may require other practices and another scope of certification, either yourself or another company you work with. So, specific to Native communities involved with agricultural endeavors that may have an interest in wild crop certification, there's a few resources noted here on this slide. Elderberry Wisdom Farm, based in Oregon, is providing internships and skill building in agricultural micro enterprises and environmental restoration. As well, the IAC, Intertribal Ag Council, is also working in partnership with TOP, providing avenues and resources for tribal members to access organic certification. So I'm just going to advance to my next and closing slide here with some more information on TOP. So this is the Transition to Organic Production Partnership. So here is free resources for technical assistance for new organic applicants that have not been certified and are looking to transition their enterprises to certified organic. So we have a point contact here, Hannah, who's noted here on this slide, that works with Oregon Tilth for the Northwest distribution of the top resources. This is an ongoing thing where we match mentors with new applicants to help with this organic system plan creation, harvesting practices, or how to comply. We do have one mentor for wild crop scope in Eastern Oregon. That could be a resource that would be available for like one-on-one counseling for these new applicants. So I'd encourage you folks to reach out to her or the Organic Transition website, organictransition.org, for more information on this unique program that's been developed, and there's funding available to help these folks access this. So great. Well, thank you, folks. I'm going to go ahead and end the slideshow here. I hope I wasn't talking too quickly. So yes, it's been great to share this information with you about organic certification of wild crops. And I'm happy to take any questions that I can that any of you folks may have. And I'm not sure if I should leave that last slide up or if y'all want to look at me directly here, but that was it. That's what I had for us today. All right.
And if anyone wants to come off mute to ask a question, just
Yeah.
So yeah.
I've got one in the chat here. Maybe I'll just hit right up because this is an important point here. So it says, what is the base certification cost for wild crop? And this is going to vary by certifier. So I kind of pointed to some state agencies, and it's an open marketplace as far as organic certification is concerned across the United States. I'll just stick with that here. I know Idaho State Department of Ag, Montana State does do it. Washington State Department of Ag has their own certification program. And so the fees are going to depend on that. So there's an initial certification, application fee, essentially, and you do pay the cost of inspection. It can run anywhere from $700 to $1,000, maybe $1,200 or better annually if you consider the cost of inspection rolled into there. I know at Oregon Tilth, we generally have like a $399 application fee. And so you might come in at $700 or less with some certifiers, and maybe well over $1,000. That said, There is cost share funding reimbursement available through the FSA, ag agencies administered by the states, and it is a federal grant funds that are administered through the state farm service agencies. You do have to get your application in, at some point earlier in the year. Generally, there's a cutoff date towards the end of the year, usually September, end of September. It pays 70% per scope of certification. So looking at, even if it's going to cost you, say, $1,000 to keep the math simple, you get reimbursed for $700, would cost you potentially $300 out of pocket annually for your organic certification cost. So that's kind of the background primer on that. Okay, so we'll read these questions as they're coming in here. So what methods, metrics does OTCO use to determine if the harvest amount is appropriate to support growth and production of the wild crop? So this can be a challenge. I outlined on that map, one parcel, 3,200 acres. They may have a couple of those parcels, and you're looking at a full day or more of inspection and driving dirt roads, accessing some of these sites. Clearly, we're not walking 3,200 acres through the brush every year to say, well, show me each spot that you harvested from. A lot different than the traditional field inspection that we would encounter of agricultural crops. So it is a challenge. Doing those mass balance and trace back exercises, I've picked on particular species. So if you have a few sites, well, what sites was this species A harvested from? How many folks were harvesting is another gauge to that metric there, and harvest days. So I want to see detailed harvest logs with some of these folks. As we know, records can be lacking. And so it can be a challenge to get accurate harvest dates and quantities and field locations or site locations where these were harvested from. So I want to see how many pounds, even if it's an estimate, per tote sizes, if they're not being weighed. Let's add those up for the whole year, for the whole harvest season. And I have had concerns in the past and tried to translate that in the report in terms of you've harvested or sold, say, 800 pounds of a particular mushroom over the year that I know has a limited harvest season, maybe 6 or 8 weeks of the year. You can only find this at those elevations that are certified. And so 800 pounds, that might be quite a lot. Have you left behind enough to sporulate and regenerate from the future? It is a challenge. I have, again, we turn to the OSP, we turn to that system plan. What do you say your practices are? So I'll use Oregon grapefruit as another example, where that yellow picture, that yellow compound you may have seen, berberine, on that first picture in one of my slides, is present in the stem. And so I have had a producer shift to, rather than digging and removing the roots, the buyer was okay with having stem as long as there weren't those prickly leaves attached. And so when you've cut that plant at the base and utilize the stem for harvesting, it is going to regenerate and grow new leaves and stems from the base, and you may be able to return to that stand in 2 or 3 years to harvest again. So looking to evaluate at the outset of producers' practices, if they're making measures towards sustainability to have less of an impact on the item they're harvesting. I think these are some good things. But if a operation has 20 harvesters on their crew and they are bringing in a large amount, truckloads of harvest at each harvest time every week, and they're drying and selling tens of thousands of pounds of a particular commodity, it may fit to the scale. If they have tens of thousands of acres or private timberland that they're harvesting from, it may make sense. But it is a challenge to evaluate. So I'm going to look at another question here. How collaborative are agencies when harvesters are concerned about future pesticide application plans in regions they are harvesting? And are there any provisions or protections of harvesting in culturally sensitive areas? Great questions. I'll kind of do my best to answer one at a time here. I would say generally, in my experience, some of the agency managers are receptive or understanding. It really depends. I think it's on a case-by-case basis. So you can draft your own form to accompany your permit application for harvesting and say that you want some verification or notifications if treatments are applied. Aerial herbicide spraying or fire retardants activities may occur in your sites that are already certified without you knowing. So being informed through the agencies, a lot of our producers will just take that setback. They may indicate a distance from a roadside, 50 feet, 100 feet. They won't harvest from any roadsides, even though the Forest Service may not spray herbicides along those roadsides. There could be dust suppressants as another example on dirt roads in certain areas. And then that dust getting on foliage of plants, you're not going to want to harvest because you want to protect the integrity of what you're harvesting as certified organic, as I mentioned, for that testing requirement that can happen at any time, and you don't want to be harvesting products with potential contaminants on them. So is that setback enough? Leaving that to the producer to determine if they think that. Well, that said, a lot of these roadside weeds we find in the sunny cuts on, not in the deep woods. And so sometimes it's a challenge to identify harvest sites that will meet the parameters of organic certification. So I think with more applicants, and I've heard, some of these folks do grumble when they come in each year. I need my letter saying these units that I'm in, nothing's been treated or applied to these areas. Or in some cases, actually, I have seen, yes, we did treat road 4036 on the west side, targeting this weed species. And so, okay, I got notification. I've seen it in writing. I'll present it to my inspector. I've put a red line on my map. I'm not going to harvest from anything near this area. And so having that transparency in the certification process is super helpful and shows that they're doing their diligence. So provisions or protections for harvesting in culturally sensitive areas. Going back to that last slide. So actually in that memo, and maybe I should pull it up for myself as a reminder, in that policy document, it does say that rare or threatened or even endangered species, thinking about plant species, their presence in an area does not automatically say that area can't be used for harvesting other species of organic wild crops. Identifying those species and their presence and what your practices will be in those sensitive areas is, I think, important. As we saw from that example, sometimes the answers are shy in the applications and they don't really give you detail onto what they're doing. And so trying to evaluate as a certification officer or an inspector if those sensitive or endangered plants are present, and what a producer's practices are is a conversation that we have, each year during that inspection or that certification cycle. So trying to verify that they are aware and being as careful as they can. I don't have a lot of specific knowledge on something like ramps, which is a kind of a Midwest or upper Midwest thing. It's like a native kind of wild oniony flavored, chefs like it, really limited season availability, harvested a lot. There are some certified organic harvesters I know doing it. It's come under this threatened category, potentially due to over harvesting by humans. And so how do we strike that balance? And yes, it's an important economic driver to keep this business going. But how do we know you're not going in and harvesting off every bunch that you find and not leaving any to produce seed or to regenerate from the bulb, the next year? And as far as, culturally sensitive areas, I think it's a super important topic and one that deserves a lot of consideration. And I just don't know how much I can speak to that here in terms of, having permission to harvest on those lands. I think is the first step, whether it's BLM, Forest Service. I have really no knowledge of tribally managed lands and what the permission or permit processes are like for harvesting of items there for a commercial endeavor. And so I'd look to learn more resources that way. Yes, there's the honorable harvest, how much to leave behind, or what plants don't deserve to be harvested for a commercial resource. And I'm super familiar with the understanding of plants as ancestors. And I have my own personal beliefs on a lot of those things. And how does that interface with these published standards and the business that we're engaged in? I'm very, fascinated and about this topic, and I could talk for an hour about that specifically, and squaring that again with the organic standards and how this relates to the topic at hand is kind of difficult for me, honestly. Well, I really appreciate the engagement on this topic. It's really great to see folks showing up and spending some time to learn more about this. And I would be interested in future questions, as was mentioned at the outset, a 201 training where we can maybe take a deeper dive into some of these specific topics, or give ourselves some times to research some specific questions and the nuance involved in that, in trying to evaluate how this can fit into some of these agricultural enterprises for folks, and specific certification requirements. Use some of these resources we've talked about today with TOP. If you're interested in certifying, thinking ahead to next year, really, for next year's certification, we'd want to get the ball rolling on that soon at some point this year, because it does take some time, especially in obtaining a lot of these documents I've mentioned, and creating a plan, and finding a site. So start that scouting this year for next year. Yeah, so we'll turn this back over to you folks, and yeah, and definitely for the next year, our next topic, it sounds like some of those land managers from the Forest Service or BLM that have gone through this process with organic wild crop harvesters to explain that process in a little detail. I've just seen it from the back end as an inspector, and myself getting permits for my own harvesting. I've never really done a commercial scale, but I definitely follow that practice as I am out there with tools and such. So thank you folks again.